Someone cuts you off in traffic. Your chest tightens. A colleague dismisses your idea in a meeting. Heat floods your face. Plans you made so carefully, they fall apart. And something inside you snaps. We've all been there. That moment when everything inside wants to react, to defend, to fight back. Our peace disappears in an instant, replaced by anger we didn't choose and sometimes barely recognize as our own. But here's what the ancient Buddhist masters discovered. The very people and situations that test us, the ones that make our blood boil and our hearts race, they're not obstacles to our peace. They're invitations. Teachers offering us something we cannot find anywhere else. There's an old teaching that says, there is no affliction like anger, and no virtue like patience. Not because patience means being passive or weak, but because it's the art of staying calm when everything in our world and everything inside us wants to react. If you're somewhere you can settle in, maybe lying down or wrapped in a blanket, this is a good time. And if it feels right, you're welcome to share where in the world you're listening from. There's something beautiful about knowing we're all seeking this same peace from different corners of the planet. To understand patience, we first need to understand what steals our peace. That's where this journey begins. There's a reason the Buddhist masters spent centuries studying anger. Not hatred, not cruelty, not violence, but anger itself. That flash of heat that rises before we've even decided to feel it. That moment when our hands shake, our vision narrows, and suddenly we're capable of things we never imagined. Anger is uniquely dangerous among all the emotions that move through us. Desire can mislead us. Pride can blind us. Envy can poison our joy. But anger does something else entirely. It steals our judgment, takes everything we've carefully built, years of patience, decades of kindness, a lifetime of trying to be good, and erases it in seconds. A father who's protected his daughter for 16 years picks up a gun in a moment of rage and destroys both their lives. A woman who's nursed her husband back from illness says words so cutting they can never be taken back. A teacher who's dedicated 30 years to students loses everything over one angry email. These aren't evil people. They're us, on our worst days. And the terrifying truth is that anger doesn't announce itself politely and ask permission. It erupts, possesses, makes us strangers to ourselves. So the ancient teachers asked a simple question. If anger is this dangerous, where does it actually come from? And can we stop it before it starts? What they discovered, through watching their own minds, with extraordinary precision, is that anger never arises by itself. It needs three conditions, three ingredients that must come together. Like fire needs fuel, oxygen, and spark. Remove even one, and there's no flame. The first ingredient is proximity to the object. This sounds almost too obvious, but it matters. You can't get angry at something you're completely unaware of. The person has to cut you off in traffic. The email has to arrive. The words have to be spoken. There has to be contact, an encounter, a moment where your life and this situation meet. The second ingredient is misinterpretation. We see what's happening through a distorted lens. Someone's quiet, and we read it as rejection. Someone forgets our birthday, and we interpret it as proof they don't care. A colleague gets the promotion, and we decide the system is rigged against us. Notice, it's not that we're deliberately lying to ourselves. These interpretations feel absolutely true in the moment. We're convinced we're seeing reality clearly, but we're actually seeing our fears, our histories, our wounds projected onto the present. And the third ingredient, this one's harder to accept, is the habitual tendency already living inside us. The Buddhist teachers call this bagchag in Tibetan. It's the groove anger has already worn in our minds from all the times before. The readiness to react, the path of least resistance. Some of us carry a deep tendency toward anger, carved by childhood, by betrayal, by all the times we felt powerless, and this was the only power we had. Others carry tendencies toward anxiety or pride or despair. We each have our particular groove, our default emergency response. Think of it like this. Imagine 3 people standing at a party. Someone walks past without saying hello. One person feels angry. How dare they ignore me? Another feels anxious. What did I do wrong? A third feels nothing. Didn't even notice. Same situation. 3 different responses. Why? Different habitual tendencies, different interpretations, different relationships to being seen or unseen. Here's the liberating part. If anger needs all 3 ingredients to arise, we have 3 ways to prevent it. The easiest, though not permanent, is simply removing ourselves from what triggers us. If your uncle's political rants at dinner make your blood boil, maybe you skip a few dinners. Not forever, not as avoidance, but as breathing room. Space to get strong enough to stay calm in his presence. This isn't a solution, but it's honest. Sometimes the most spiritual thing we can do is admit we're not ready yet. Give ourselves time to build resilience before walking back into the fire. The third ingredient, the habitual tendency itself, is the hardest to uproot completely. It can be done, but it requires years of deep practice, meditation that penetrates the roots of reactivity. The Buddhist texts call this path long and demanding, though ultimately liberating. But the second ingredient, misinterpretation, this is where most of us can actually work. This is where the teachings focus their attention. Because if we can learn to see situations more clearly, more accurately, more spaciously, the anger often doesn't arise at all. Let's look honestly at what anger actually protects. What's really at stake when we feel that heat rising? The truth is simple, almost embarrassingly so. Anger only happens in two situations. Either someone does something we don't want, or someone interrupts something we do want. That's it. We're not that complicated. But what do we want? What are we protecting so fiercely that we're willing to burn bridges and damage hearts to defend it? The ancient texts talk about 4 worldly concerns that drive most of our reactivity. We want pleasure, comfort, ease, good feelings. We want gain, possessions, money, security, things. We want praise, approval, recognition, to be told we matter. And we want reputation, to be important, to stand out, to be someone people respect. Watch your own reactions this week. Notice when irritation flares up. Isn't it almost always because one of these 4 feels threatened? Someone cancels plans. There goes your anticipated pleasure. A co-worker gets credit for your idea. There goes recognition and possibly advancement. A friend forgets to return your book. There goes your sense of being valued. A stranger cuts in line. There goes fairness, and maybe the subtle way you prove you matter by getting things first. Now the teachings get even more specific. They map out 24 distinct causes of anger, not to overwhelm us, but to help us see the patterns clearly. 4 causes relate directly to us. Someone interferes with our pleasure. You planned a quiet evening, and surprise guests arrive. Someone blocks our gain. You were in line for the promotion, and politics changed the outcome. Someone withholds praise we expected. You worked late all week, and your boss says nothing. Someone diminishes our reputation. Gossip spreads, or you're publicly corrected, or simply ignored when you thought you'd be celebrated. But here's where it gets interesting. We don't only get angry about what happens to us directly. Another 4 causes relate to people we love. When someone hurts your child's feelings, your anger rises instantly. When your partner is passed over for recognition they deserved, you feel it in your chest. When a friend is betrayed, their pain becomes your rage. We carry the 4 worldly concerns, not just for ourselves, but for everyone in our circle. Parents, children, partners, close friends. And then, this part surprises people. Another 4 causes relate to our enemies. Or more accurately, to people we've decided we don't like. When they succeed, it bothers us. When they're praised, it stings. When they gain something valuable, we feel cheated, even though it has nothing to do with us. When they seem happy, it irritates us in a way we're almost ashamed to admit. So that's 12 causes. 4 for us, 4 for loved ones, 4 for people we dislike. But the opposite of each also triggers us, which doubles it to 24, When someone praises us excessively, we might get angry, suspicious of manipulation, or uncomfortable with attention. When a loved one receives criticism, anger rises to defend them. When our enemy faces loss or suffering, we might feel a guilty satisfaction, but if others rush to comfort them, that attention itself can spark resentment. The classical texts even add a time dimension. We get angry about the past. Remember when he stole that promotion from me 3 years ago? We get angry about the present. What's happening right now? And we get angry about the future. I'm worried she's going to betray me. So, I'm already building my defense. 24 causes times 3 time periods equals 72 different flavors of anger. 72 ways we can lose our peace. But notice something crucial about all of them. Every single trigger, all 72 variations, shares one common thread. There's something at stake. We've placed our happiness, our sense of safety, our very worth in something outside ourselves. In what others think, what we possess, what happens or doesn't happen. We're constantly betting on conditions we can't control. And when those conditions shift, when the world doesn't cooperate with our plan, when people don't behave as we need them to, we feel it as betrayal, as emergency, as threat. The more our happiness depends on things out there, other people's approval, material success, everything going according to plan, the more vulnerable we become. The more easily disturbed, the more quickly we lose our center. A person whose peace depends on always being praised lives at the mercy of every opinion. Someone whose worth is tied to possessions feels threatened by every financial shift. When we need life to unfold exactly as we've decided it should, reality becomes our enemy. This isn't about becoming cold or detached. It's about recognizing where we've unconsciously handed over the remote control to our inner peace, given it to our boss, our partner, our bank account, the algorithm that decides who sees our posts. The teachings point to something radical. What if our happiness could come from inside, not dependent on whether we're praised or criticized today, whether we gain or lose, whether pleasure arrives or disappointment shows up? There are 2 paths the Buddhist masters offer for reducing this reactivity. The first is loosening our grip on what we're clinging to. Those 4 worldly concerns: pleasure, gain, praise, reputation. They're not evil, but our obsession with them makes us fragile. The tighter we hold, the more it hurts when life pries our fingers open. This happens through contemplating impermanence, not as depressing philosophy, but as simple truth. Everything changes. The promotion you didn't get, 3 years from now you might be grateful you stayed where you were. The criticism that stung today, next month you won't remember who said it. The possession you're desperate to acquire, someday you'll donate it or forget you own it. when we really accept that everything is temporary, including our circumstances, including this very mood we're in right now, something relaxes, not because we stop caring, but because we stop gripping so desperately. The second path is expanding love and compassion. The more genuinely we care about others' well-being, the less obsessed we become with protecting our own narrow interests. A person with a big heart doesn't feel as threatened by small slights. These two paths work together, letting go and opening up, releasing tight control and softening into kindness, like two wings that lift us above the triggers that used to pull us under. Here's what actually happens when anger arises. Follow the sequence closely, because this is where we can intervene. First, we're invested in something, one of those four concerns, an expectation about how things should go. We're convinced this outcome will make us happy. Then reality shows up and doesn't match our plan. The mismatch between expectation and reality creates disappointment. At this point, we have a choice. We could accept what's actually happening, adjust our expectations, make peace with this moment as it is, pivot to what's possible now. But when we're heavily invested, when our happiness feels like it depends on getting our way, we don't accept. We insist. We push against what's real. No, this isn't right. This isn't fair. This isn't what should be happening. That insistence creates frustration. And frustration is like kindling. Any small spark, a look, a word, a memory, and suddenly we're engulfed. Anger erupts from the friction between what we demand and what actually is. So there's a sequence. Investment creates expectation. Expectation meets reality. Reality disappoints. Disappointment meets resistance. Resistance creates frustration. Frustration ignites into anger. Breaking this chain anywhere along the way prevents the fire. But the most accessible point of intervention is at acceptance. That moment when reality reveals itself as different from our plan. The Buddhist word for this is often translated as acceptance, but that can sound passive, like defeat. A better translation might be recognition, simply seeing clearly what's true right now, not what should be true, not what we wish were true, not what we're going to make true in the future, just what is. When we recognize reality without the filter of our demands, something shifts. We can still work to change what's changeable. We can still have preferences, but we're no longer at war with the present moment. And that war is what exhausts us, what makes us vulnerable to anger's takeover. Understanding these 72 triggers isn't about memorizing a list. It's about becoming aware of your own patterns. Which of the four worldly concerns hooks you most easily? Is it praise you crave, or reputation, or material security, or simply comfort? And who do you extend that protection to? Just yourself? Your immediate family? Your whole tribe? The more widely we cast that protective net, the more opportunities for anger to arise. This isn't diagnosis, it's self-discovery. And here's the compassionate truth beneath it all. These patterns aren't character flaws. They're how we've learned to protect ourselves in a world that often felt unsafe. The child who learned that being praised meant being safe naturally grows into an adult who craves recognition. The person who experienced poverty naturally guards their resources. The one who was ignored learns to fight for visibility. Our anger triggers are actually maps of our old wounds. Places we still feel vulnerable. Territory we're still defending. Because once upon a time, we had to. But recognizing the pattern is the first step toward freedom. When you notice, oh, there it is again, my need for recognition getting triggered, that very awareness creates space. A gap between trigger and reaction. A breath where choice becomes possible. And in that gap, we can remember, this person who just criticized me, they're not my enemy. They're probably in their own storm, their own confusion. This situation that's not going as planned, it's not a catastrophe. It's just life being life, unpredictable and wild and real. The Buddhist masters studied anger so carefully because they understood something we often forget. Our peace is too precious to lose over things that won't matter next month. Our relationships are too valuable to destroy in moments we'll later regret. Our own hearts deserve better than being held hostage by conditions we can't control. So we learn the architecture of anger, not to become experts in theory, but to become free in practice. To notice when those three conditions start aligning: proximity, misinterpretation, habitual tendency. To catch ourselves before we're caught. To choose in that crucial moment, to see clearly rather than react blindly. This is patience. Not the patience of endurance, but the patience of wisdom. Understanding what's really happening beneath our reactions and choosing peace over the temporary satisfaction of rage. Because when anger burns through us, it burns through everything we've built. But when we understand its roots and recognize its patterns, we finally have a choice. And that choice changes everything. There's a particular kind of patience the Buddhist teachings describe first, because it's the one we need most urgently in daily life. It's patience with people who disturb our peace, the ones who criticize us, dismiss us, betray us, or simply get in our way. We call them aggressors, but that word carries assumptions we might want to examine. Because here's what the masters observed after watching human behavior with extraordinary care. Most of what we experience as attack isn't actually aimed at us at all. Imagine someone drowning in a river. They're thrashing, panicking, fighting for air. Their arms flail wildly in every direction, and you happen to be standing close enough that a few drops of water splash onto your clothes. Are they attacking you, or are they just drowning? The person who snaps at you in the grocery store isn't plotting your humiliation. They just lost their job, or their marriage is crumbling, or they're terrified about test results they got this morning. They're drowning in their own suffering, thrashing in their own confusion, and you happen to be near enough to catch the splash. This isn't naive optimism. It's what becomes visible when we watch carefully. The colleague who constantly undermines you, they're usually protecting a wound you can't see. The family member who always criticizes, they're often projecting their disappointment with themselves. The friend who betrayed your trust, they were probably drowning in needs they didn't know how to meet honestly. Most people aren't strategic in their cruelty. They're clumsy in their pain. We imagine that when someone hurts us, we're in their crosshairs, the target of deliberate malice. We think they planned it, calculated it, wanted specifically to wound us. And sometimes that's true. But far more often, we're just nearby when their internal storm hits. The Buddhist teachings offer a phrase that captures this perfectly. They're as confused as we are, just wearing different masks. You know your own confusion intimately. You know how your emotions hijack you, how you say things you regret, how you react before you think, how old wounds suddenly take control and you become someone you barely recognize. You know how messy and complicated it is inside your own mind and heart. Why would anyone else be different? The person who hurt you yesterday, they have the same confusion, the same wounds, the same patterns running them. They're not villains in your story. They're the protagonist in their own story, trying to survive, trying to matter, trying to avoid pain and find safety, just like you. This recognition doesn't make their behavior acceptable. It doesn't mean we allow harm or pretend everything's fine, but it changes something fundamental in how we hold the situation. We stop taking it quite so personally. We see the tragedy happening in them, not just the offense happening to us. And this shift from seeing an enemy to seeing a suffering person, this is where patience becomes possible. Now let's be honest about what usually happens instead. The sequence we explored earlier, the path from peace to anger, plays out again and again. We have an expectation about how people should treat us. It's often unconscious, just a background assumption. People should be kind, fair, respectful, honest. Our friends should remember our birthdays. Our co-workers should acknowledge our contributions. Our partners should understand our needs without us having to explain. Then reality shows up differently. Someone forgets, dismisses, ignores, betrays. And there's that jolt of mismatch, that moment where what we expected and what's actually happening don't a line. This is where everything pivots. If we can accept what's real, not approve of it, not like it, just recognize, oh, this is what's actually happening right now, then we stay grounded. Disappointed maybe, but still present, still able to respond wisely. But if we resist, if we dig in our heels and insist, no, this shouldn't be happening, this isn't right, this isn't fair, then disappointment hardens into frustration. And frustration is a powder keg. Any spark, another slight, a remembered grievance, even just their tone of voice, and we explode into anger. The teaching is pointing to something subtle but powerful. Acceptance isn't passive surrender. It's clear recognition of what is. When we accept reality, we're free to work with it skillfully. But when we're busy fighting with reality, insisting it should be different, we're trapped in a fantasy while life moves on without us. There's a woman whose story illuminates this teaching in the most heartbreaking and beautiful way. Her name was Patakara, and she lived in India during the Buddha's time. She came from a wealthy family, loved a servant, and when her parents forbade the relationship, she ran away with him. They built a simple life together in a small village far from her family. She became pregnant. As her time approached to give birth, she wanted to return to her parents' home, wanted her mother there for the birth, wanted reconciliation, wanted the safety of family. Her husband kept delaying, perhaps ashamed, perhaps afraid of her father's anger. Finally, when she was already in labor, he agreed they should go. They set out on the road, but the baby came too quickly. She gave birth right there, beside the path. Her husband went to find shelter and materials to keep her warm. A storm was gathering, dark clouds filling the sky. He never came back. She waited through the night, holding her newborn, calling his name into the wind. When dawn came, she went looking and found him dead, bitten by a snake in the darkness. Devastated but needing shelter for her infant, she continued toward her parents' home, now carrying both the newborn and her young son from a previous birth. They came to a river, swollen from the storm. The water was too high to carry both children at once. So she left the older boy on the bank and carried the baby across. She placed the infant safely on the far shore and turned back for her son. But as she waded into the river, a hawk circling overhead saw the tiny baby, alone and unprotected. It swooped down. She screamed, waving her arms frantically, trying to scare the bird away. But her older son, hearing her shouts, thought she was calling him to cross. He jumped into the rushing water and was immediately swept away. She couldn't reach him. She couldn't save the baby from the hawk. In the space of moments, both children were gone. She continued walking toward her parents' home, now in complete shock, moving like someone already dead. When she finally reached her family's village, a neighbor stopped her before she could reach the house. "Don't go there," the neighbor said gently. "There was a terrible storm last night. The house collapsed. Your mother, your father, your brother, all three died in the night." In one day, one single day, Patakara lost her husband, both her children, and her entire family of origin. Her mind broke under the weight of it. She tore off her clothes and wandered the streets, naked and mad with grief, screaming for her children, unable to recognize anyone or anything. People threw stones, chased her away from villages, treated her as a crazy woman to be feared. This went on for months, maybe years. The texts aren't clear. She was trapped in a hell of loss, reliving those moments over and over, unable to accept what had happened, unable to return to sanity, because sanity meant facing an unbearable truth. One day, still wandering, still mad, she stumbled into a place where a large crowd had gathered. The Buddha was teaching there. When people in the crowd saw this naked, wild-eyed woman approaching, they tried to keep her away. But the Buddha told them to let her come. He looked at her with such compassion, such steady presence, that something in her recognized safety. Someone gave her a robe to cover herself. She sat down, still trembling, still barely present. And the Buddha began to teach, not complex philosophy, not elaborate doctrine, but the simple truth she needed to hear. He taught about impermanence, about how everything that arises passes away, how we cannot hold on to what we love, no matter how tightly we grasp, how this isn't cruelty, but simply the nature of existence. Everything changes, everything ends, nothing stays. He didn't teach it as philosophy to be studied. He taught it as medicine for someone dying of resistance to reality. As she listened, something shifted. The teaching wasn't telling her that her loss didn't matter, that her pain was wrong, that she should just get over it. It was telling her that loss is woven into the fabric of existence, that she wasn't being punished by the universe, that this unbearable thing was part of the same impermanence that allows flowers to bloom and children to be born in the first place. Her mind began to clear. Not because the pain disappeared. It didn't, but because she stopped fighting with the reality of what had happened. She stopped insisting that the universe had made a mistake, that this shouldn't have occurred, that somewhere there must be a way to undo it. She accepted, not in defeat, but in recognition. This is what happened. This is what is. And in that acceptance, she found she could breathe again, could think again, could live again, even carrying this immense grief. She became the Buddha's student. She practiced deeply, not to escape her pain, but to understand the nature of all experience, how it arises, how it passes, how we create suffering by grasping at what cannot be held. And eventually, through years of practice, Patakara became one of the most accomplished teachers in the Buddhist community. She taught particularly about impermanence because she had lived through the most extreme demonstration of it. She knew from direct experience what the teaching meant, not as concept, but as survived reality. Other women who lost children would come to her, and she could meet them in their grief with total understanding. She didn't tell them to stop feeling. She showed them how to carry unbearable loss without being destroyed by the carrying. The texts say she became an arhat, someone who had completely freed their mind from reactive patterns, from the compulsive grasping that creates suffering. She found peace, not by avoiding pain, but by fully understanding its nature. Here's what her story teaches about patience with people who test us, with circumstances that wound us. The greatest teachers of patience are often those who've lost everything and discovered that peace remains possible anyway. Not because tragedy is good, not because suffering doesn't matter, but because the deepest patience comes from accepting what is, while staying open to what's still possible. When someone betrays you, criticizes you, abandons you, it's nothing like what Patakara endured. But the principle is the same. You can fight with reality, insist it shouldn't have happened, replay it endlessly in your mind, demanding a different outcome. Or you can recognize what is, feel what you feel about it, and still find ground to stand on. Patakara shows us that even the most devastating losses don't have to destroy us if we can move from resistance to recognition. From demanding reality be different to accepting reality as it is. This doesn't mean becoming passive. Patakara didn't just accept suffering and do nothing. She became a powerful teacher who helped countless others. Acceptance freed her to act wisely rather than react blindly. When we accept that someone has hurt us, we're free to decide how to respond. Set a boundary, end a relationship, or extend forgiveness, all become possible when we're not trapped in fighting with the fact that it happened. Now, the Buddhist teachings take this even further, into territory that might sound almost outrageous at first. They suggest that difficult people aren't just neutral obstacles we must tolerate. They're actually precious opportunities, spiritual teachers disguised as problems. There's a teaching that says enemies are as rare as Buddhas. Think about what that means. A Buddha is someone so fully awakened, so completely wise and compassionate that encountering them transforms your life. Rare, precious, worthy of traveling continents to meet. And the teaching is saying that a difficult person, someone who irritates you, challenges you, pushes your buttons, is equally rare and precious. Not despite being difficult, but because of it. Here's why. If you want to develop generosity, you need someone who needs something. A beggar on the street isn't an obstacle to your generosity. They're the only reason you can practice generosity in that moment. Without them, your generosity remains theoretical, untested, just a nice idea you have about yourself. The same with patience. If everyone around you is always kind, supportive, agreeable, and fair, you never develop real patience. You might think you're patient, but you've never actually been tested. It's like claiming to be strong without ever lifting anything heavy. The difficult person, the one who criticizes unfairly, who takes credit for your work, who seems to go out of their way to make your life harder, they're offering you something irreplaceable. A chance to practice staying calm when everything inside wants to react. An opportunity to develop the patience that can't be learned from books or developed in meditation alone. There's a beautiful metaphor the teachers use. When you sharpen a knife on a whetstone, two things happen simultaneously. The stone grinds away the dull metal, refining the blade's edge. But the knife also wears down the stone. They change each other through their friction. When someone criticizes you harshly, if you can stay present instead of reacting, something gets worn away in you. The brittle defensiveness, the desperate need to be right, the fragile ego that can't tolerate any challenge, it gets ground down a little. Your mind becomes sharper, clearer, more resilient. But also, and this is easy to miss, your patience wears down their aggression over time. Not always, not quickly, but genuine patience has a power that reactive defensiveness never does. When you don't give them the fight they expect, something shifts in the dynamic between you. The ancient texts even suggest something that might sound strange to modern ears. They say that when someone criticizes you, insults you, challenges you, if you can receive it without reacting, you're burning karma inexpensively. What does that mean? The idea is that we carry consequences from past actions, past patterns that need to be resolved somehow. Usually those consequences play out through dramatic events, illness, loss, conflict that tears your life apart. But if you can let someone's words pierce your pride without retaliating, if you can let criticism land without defending, you're working through those old patterns with just words instead of disasters. Whether or not you believe in karma as a cosmic system, there's psychological truth here. Every time you stay calm when tested, you're weakening old, reactive patterns, rewriting neural pathways, proving to yourself that you can tolerate discomfort without collapsing or lashing out. And that capacity to be okay even when someone isn't okay with you, that's freedom. So here's the invitation for this week. Not a command, not homework, just an experiment if you're curious. Think of one person who regularly tests your patience. Maybe it's a family member who always finds something to criticize. Maybe it's a coworker who takes credit, or a neighbor who complains. Someone who makes your jaw clench just thinking about them. For 1 week, Practice seeing them differently. Not as your enemy, not as your problem to fix, but as someone drowning in their own confusion. Someone wearing a different mask, but carrying the same human struggles you carry. When they do the thing that usually triggers you, pause for just one breath before responding. In that pause, remember, they're not strategically attacking you. They're thrashing in their own river, and you happen to be close enough to get splashed. Notice what happens. Not whether you suddenly like them, or whether they change. They might not. Notice what happens in you. Do you feel even slightly less hooked? Even marginally more spacious? Even a little bit freer? This isn't about being nice to people who don't deserve it. It's about liberating yourself from the exhausting work of taking everything personally. It's about discovering that your peace doesn't have to depend on others behaving perfectly. The first type of patience with people who test us, is really patience with reality itself. The reality that people are messy, confused, sometimes hurtful, and almost never doing it because of you. When we can hold that truth with compassion instead of resentment, when we can see the drowning person instead of just feeling the splash, patience stops being something we force and becomes something that naturally arises. Not because we've become passive or weak, but because we've become wise enough to know the difference between what deserves our peace and what doesn't. And most of what we thought was attacking us, it was never about us at all. If the first type of patience is about staying calm when other people test us, the second type is about something more subtle and perhaps more challenging. It's patience with the spiritual path itself, with the difficulties, discomforts, and discouragements that arise not from external circumstances, but from the practice of transformation. This might sound strange at first. We usually think of meditation, contemplation, and spiritual practice as solutions to our problems, not as problems themselves. But anyone who's practiced seriously for more than a few months knows the truth. The path has its own challenges, its own tests, its own ways of confronting us with exactly what we'd rather avoid. And most people quit. Not because the practice doesn't work, but because they can't tolerate the phase where it seems like nothing's working. Let's be honest about what actually happens when someone begins a spiritual practice. There's a predictable pattern, almost like seasons, that nearly every practitioner moves through. The first phase is what we might call the honeymoon. Everything feels fresh, exciting, full of possibility. You discover meditation, or Buddhist teachings, or contemplative practice, and it's like falling in love. There's novelty, there's wonder, there's the thrill of discovering something that speaks to your deepest questions. You sit down to meditate, and time disappears. You read a teaching, and it illuminates something you've always sensed but never had words for. You feel like you've finally found what you've been searching for your whole life. This is it, you think. This is amazing. During this phase, practice is easy because it's rewarding. Every session brings some new insight, some pleasant experience, some confirmation that you're on the right path. You tell your friends about it. You rearrange your schedule to make time for it. You might even feel a little superior to people who haven't discovered what you've discovered. This phase can last weeks or months, depending on the person and the practice. And it's genuinely valuable. This initial enthusiasm often provides the momentum needed to establish a habit. But it's not yet transformation. It's consumption. You're still treating the practice like entertainment, like something that's supposed to give you pleasant experiences. Then comes the second phase. And this is where most people's practice quietly dies. We might call this the desert phase, or the plateau, or simply the boring middle. The novelty wears off. Meditation stops being an exciting adventure and starts feeling like a chore. You sit down and nothing special happens. Your mind wanders just like it did yesterday and the day before. The teachings you found so profound start to sound repetitive. This is the phase where you start thinking, is this even working? Where you wonder if maybe you're doing it wrong, or if this particular practice isn't right for you, or if perhaps you need a teacher, or a retreat, or a different technique. The practice that once felt like medicine now feels like tedious obligation. And here's what happens to most people. They assume something's wrong. They think the boredom means the practice has stopped working, or that they've somehow failed. So they switch to something else, a different meditation technique, a different tradition, a different teacher. And for a while, the novelty returns. New honeymoon phase. But eventually, this practice too becomes familiar, predictable, boring. Some people spend years, even decades, collecting practices this way. They have a whole menu of techniques they've tried, traditions they've explored, teachers they've studied with briefly. They can talk knowledgeably about many paths, but none of them have actually transformed who they are, because they never stayed with anything long enough to move through the desert and reach what lies on the other side. The third phase is where genuine transformation begins. But you only reach it by continuing to practice through the second phase, through the boredom, through the doubt, through the months or years where nothing seems to be happening. In this third phase, something shifts. Practice stops being about having experiences and starts being about training capacity. You're no longer consuming the practice. The practice is reshaping you. You discover a kind of joy that's not dependent on anything feeling good or interesting. You understand from the inside what the teachings have been pointing to all along. But here's the key insight that changes everything when you understand it. Most people never reach the third phase because they can't tolerate the second. It's like the difference between dating and marriage. Dating is exciting. There's mystery, anticipation, the thrill of discovery. Everything feels heightened. But that intensity doesn't last, and it's not supposed to. Marriage, or any long-term committed relationship, moves through the excitement into something deeper: intimacy, trust, knowing someone beyond their surface charm. But you only get there by staying when it stops being exciting. The spiritual path works the same way. The honeymoon phase is dating, fun, thrilling, but ultimately superficial. The desert phase is where the real relationship begins, where you discover whether you're actually committed or just enjoying the high. And the depths phase is where true intimacy with practice develops, where transformation becomes possible. There's a story from the Buddhist tradition that illustrates this teaching perfectly. It's about a monk named Kulapanthaka, and it's one of the most encouraging stories for anyone who's ever struggled with practice. Kulapanthaka lived during the Buddha's time, and he had an older brother named Mahapanthaka, who was brilliant. Mahapanthaka memorized teachings effortlessly, understood complex philosophy immediately, became an accomplished monk, and eventually an arhat, fully enlightened. He was the kind of student every teacher loves, quick and bright, and apparently destined for greatness. Kulapanthaka was nothing like his brother. He tried to memorize even the simplest verse and couldn't hold it in his mind. Teachers would spend hours explaining a concept and he'd forget it by the next day. He was slow, confused, seemingly incapable of understanding what everyone else grasped easily. For months, Mahapanthaka tried to teach his younger brother. He'd repeat verses until they were both exhausted. He'd explain teachings in the simplest possible terms. Nothing worked. Kulapanthaka remained as confused as ever, unable to memorize even a single stanza. Finally, Mahapanthaka gave up. He took his brother aside and said, "You're too stupid for this path." Not from cruelty, but from a kind of resigned honesty. You can't memorize anything. You can't understand the teachings. You're wasting your time here. He told Kulapanthaka to leave the monastery and return to ordinary life. Kulapanthaka was devastated. He sat outside the monastery gates weeping, feeling like a complete failure, convinced he was too dull-minded to ever progress spiritually. The Buddha happened to walk by and saw him crying. "What's wrong?" he asked. Kulapanthaka explained through tears that his brother had expelled him, that he was too stupid to be a monk, that he couldn't memorize even one verse, no matter how hard he tried. The Buddha looked at him with compassion and said something surprising. "Your brother is wrong." Then he asked Kulapanthaka a simple question. "Can you do one thing? Just one simple thing?" Kulapanthaka nodded, desperate for any chance to stay. The Buddha gave him a broom. "Sweep the floor of the monastery every day. That was the whole instruction. While you sweep, contemplate these 2 words: removal of dust. Not a complex philosophy, not a lengthy teaching, just 2 words: removal of dust. Kulapanthaka took the broom and began sweeping. Every day, he swept the monastery floors. Every day, he thought about those 2 words: removal of dust. Removing physical dust from the floor. Removing the dust of confusion from his mind. Removing the dust of self-judgment. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Other monks laughed at him. Look at Kulapanthaka, so stupid he can only sweep floors. Even the novices made jokes. But he kept sweeping, kept contemplating. Removal of dust. Nothing dramatic happened. No visions, no sudden insights, no pleasant meditation experiences. Just sweeping, day after day, while everyone else studied complex teachings and had impressive realizations. It would have been so easy to quit, to decide this simple practice wasn't enough, to feel like he was being left behind. But Kulapanthaka had something many brilliant people lack. He had humility born from having no other choice, and he had persistence born from genuine commitment rather than ego. He wasn't trying to prove anything or achieve anything. He was just doing the one thing he'd been asked to do. Then, one day, after months of this simple practice, something shifted. As he swept, Kulapanthaka suddenly understood what he'd been doing all along. Removal of dust wasn't just about floors, or even about mental clarity. It was about the fundamental nature of practice, removing the layers of confusion, attachment, and false identity that obscure our true nature. In that moment, his mind opened. All the teachings his brother had tried to force into his head suddenly made perfect sense, not as memorized words, but as lived understanding. He saw through the illusion of self, understood impermanence directly, recognized the patterns that create suffering. He became an arhat, fully awakened through the simplest possible practice. When the other monks heard what had happened, they were stunned. The stupid one who could barely memorize a verse had achieved what most of them were still striving for. Even his brilliant brother was amazed. The Buddha used Kulapanthaka as a teaching example for the rest of his life. Here was proof that the path isn't about intelligence or natural talent or impressive experiences. It's about showing up consistently with simple, honest practice, even when nothing seems to be happening. The healing lesson in Kulapanthaka's story cuts against everything our culture teaches us about achievement. The path isn't about being clever. It's not about collecting techniques or impressing others with your insights. It's about showing up when it's boring, when it's hard, when nothing seems to happen, when everyone else appears to be progressing faster than you. Most people would have quit after a week of sweeping floors, while others studied sophisticated philosophy. Most would have decided this simple practice wasn't enough, that they needed something more advanced, or interesting. But Kulapanthaka's limitation became his strength. Because he couldn't do complex practices, he had no choice but to stay with the simple one until it transformed him completely. This is the second type of patience. Tolerating the boring phases, the difficult phases, the phases where you wonder if you're wasting your time. Trusting the process even when you can't see results. Continuing to practice, not because it feels good, but because you've made a commitment to transformation that goes deeper than comfort. Now we need to talk about why this kind of patience is so difficult, especially for intelligent, capable people. There's a particular kind of self-sabotage that spiritual practitioners excel at, and it's most common among those who are smart, educated, and used to succeeding at things they attempt. They create sophisticated justifications for avoiding what actually needs to change. Here's how it works. People who don't know much about spiritual practice make obvious mistakes. They chase pleasure, avoid discomfort, give up when things get hard. Their obstacles are straightforward and relatively easy to recognize. But people who've learned the vocabulary, who've read the books, who understand the principles, they create much more subtle traps. They practice in ways that look like progress, but don't actually threaten their ego or require real change. One common trap is emphasizing what you've already mastered, while avoiding what you actually need to work on. If your challenge is desire and attachment, you become obsessed with studying anger. If your problem is anger, you focus all your energy on understanding desire. If you lack discipline, you emphasize the importance of wisdom study. If you're all study and no practice, you convince yourself that understanding is enough. It's brilliant, really. You look like a dedicated practitioner. You're doing something, but your ego feels completely safe because you're working on everything except what would actually change you. You can practice this way for years, even decades, accumulating knowledge and techniques while remaining fundamentally unchanged. Another trap is choosing practices that are comfortable rather than challenging. If sitting still makes you anxious, you emphasize movement practices. If silence confronts you with difficult emotions, you focus on chanting or ritual. If being alone with your mind is unbearable, you make community practice your primary path. None of these things are wrong in themselves. Movement, chanting, community, all are valuable aspects of practice. But when we choose them specifically, because they let us avoid what's difficult, they become spiritual, bypassing, dressed up as dedication. The teaching uses two words to distinguish what's happening here. There's genuine self-worth, autoestima in Spanish, which is knowing your fundamental value isn't dependent on achievement or others' opinions. And there's defensive pride, orgullo, which is constantly protecting a fragile sense of self from any threat or challenge. When we have genuine self-worth, we can hear difficult feedback without collapsing. We can admit where we're struggling without feeling like failures. We can let a teacher or teaching point out our blind spots because we're not basing our entire identity on being advanced or accomplished. But when we're operating from defensive pride, every challenge feels like a personal attack. We can't tolerate being a beginner at anything. We need to maintain the appearance of having it together, of being spiritually mature, of not having the embarrassing problems that less advanced practitioners have. And ironically, this defensive pride makes us unteachable. We can't receive the medicine we most need because accepting it would require admitting something's wrong with us. So we stay sick while collecting remedies for illnesses we don't have. The mature practitioner understands something that the beginner doesn't. Real progress requires postponing immediate gratification for lasting transformation. It means choosing what's beneficial over what's comfortable, what works over what feels good in the moment. There's actually research on this. Scientists put children in a room with one marshmallow and told them, if you can wait 5 minutes without eating it, you'll get 2 marshmallows. Some children grabbed it immediately. Others waited, struggling, but ultimately getting the bigger reward. Then they followed these children for years, into adolescence, adulthood, middle age, and they found something remarkable. The children who could delay gratification had better health, better relationships, more emotional stability, and even earned more money as adults. The ability to tolerate discomfort for a future benefit, that's maturity. That's what separates genuine spiritual practice from spiritual entertainment. In spiritual terms, this means having empathy for your future self. Not just caring about how you feel right now, this moment, but caring about the person you'll be in a year, 5 years, at the end of your life. How often do you pause and think, will my future self be grateful for this choice? Or do you habitually betray that future person for temporary comfort or pleasure? We're all experts at justifying the comfortable choice. When presented with what we want versus what's good for us, we can construct elaborate arguments for why what we want is actually what's best. I need rest. I work better under less pressure. Forcing myself would be inauthentic. Everyone's path is different. All of these can be true, but they can also be sophisticated lies we tell ourselves when we're not ready to change. The difference between wisdom and self-deception is often invisible to the person doing the deceiving. This is why the second type of patience is so crucial and so difficult. It requires being honest with ourselves when honesty is uncomfortable. It requires continuing to practice through the phases where nothing seems to be happening It requires letting go of the need to feel advanced, or special, or better than others. Kulapanthaka had no choice but to develop this patience. He couldn't trick himself into thinking he was making progress when he wasn't. He couldn't collect practices to feel accomplished. He could only sweep, day after day, trusting that what he'd been asked to do would eventually bear fruit, even though he couldn't see how. For most of us, developing this patience requires conscious choice. It means choosing one practice and staying with it through the honeymoon, through the desert, into the depths. It means being willing to be humbled, to fail, to look foolish, to struggle with things others seem to manage easily. It means accepting that transformation isn't supposed to be comfortable or entertaining. It's supposed to be transforming. And transformation means letting go of who you've been to become who you're capable of being. That's never entirely comfortable. The good news is that once you understand this, once you see the pattern of honeymoon, desert, and depths, you stop interpreting boredom as failure. You recognize it as a sign that you're right where you need to be, in that crucial middle phase, where most people quit, but where actual transformation is quietly beginning. You stop collecting practices and start deepening into one. You stop seeking impressive experiences and start developing capacity. You stop performing spirituality for others or yourself and start doing the actual work of change. This is patience with the path itself. Not giving up when it stops being exciting. Not quitting when it gets difficult. Not justifying comfortable choices that keep you safe from real transformation. Just showing up, day after day, like Kulapanthaka, with his broom, trusting that simple, consistent practice is what changes us. Not cleverness, not intensity, not impressive experiences. Just showing up when it's boring, when it's hard, when nothing seems to happen. That's when transformation is actually occurring, even though we can't see it yet. That's when the real practice begins. The first two types of patience deal with things we can, theoretically, influence. We can learn to respond differently to difficult people. We can persist through the challenges of spiritual practice. But the third type of patience confronts us with something harder. Reality itself, in its most unchangeable forms. This is patience with what simply is. With impermanence, with loss, with the fundamental uncertainty of existence. With truths we'd rather not accept, but cannot ultimately avoid. Most of our suffering comes from fighting with reality. Not from what happens, but from our insistence that it shouldn't have happened, or shouldn't be happening now. We place our happiness in how we believe things should be, and then reality shows up differently, and we go to war. Think about the last time you were really upset. Underneath the specific situation, wasn't there a sense of, this isn't right, This shouldn't be this way. Someone should have behaved differently. The outcome should have been fair. Life should have cooperated with your plans. That word should is where suffering lives. We create a story about how things are supposed to unfold. We invest our peace, our happiness, our sense of okayness in that story becoming reality. Then life does what life does, which is often something completely different from our story, and we feel betrayed. Not just disappointed, but fundamentally wronged, as if reality itself has broken a promise. The sequence plays out like this. We form an expectation about how things will or should go. Reality doesn't match that expectation. Disappointment arises naturally. That's just the feeling of mismatch between hope and outcome. But here's where it gets complicated. At this point, we have a choice we're rarely conscious of making. We can accept what's real, not approve of it, just acknowledge, oh, this is what's actually happening, or we can resist. When we resist, when we dig in and insist, no, this isn't acceptable, this has to change, I won't make peace with this, disappointment hardens into something more painful. Into frustration, resentment, even rage. We're now at war with what is, and that war is exhausting and ultimately unwinnable. There's a teaching that expresses this with beautiful simplicity. If something has a solution, don't worry, it can be fixed. If something has no solution, don't worry, it can't be fixed. It sounds almost too simple, doesn't it? But sit with it for a moment. If you can fix something, worrying doesn't help. Just fix it. If you can't fix it, worrying doesn't help. It's already done. The real problem is that we have trouble telling the difference. We treat things that are already finished as if they're still negotiable. We waste energy fighting battles that were already decided. And sometimes we give up on things that could actually be changed if we approach them differently. A relationship ended 3 years ago, but we're still replaying it, arguing with the person in our minds, insisting they should have behaved differently. They should have, perhaps, but they didn't. That's over, unchangeable, finished. Yet we're still fighting with it, as if our insistence could somehow rewrite the past. Or we accept mistreatment as inevitable when we could actually set boundaries, speak up, or leave. We confuse acceptance with passivity, so we stay stuck in situations that are genuinely changeable because we think patience means enduring everything. The wisdom is learning to distinguish between what's actually fixed and what's still fluid, between what we need to accept because it's already done and what we need to address because it's still happening. The Buddha once taught this through a story so simple it's easy to miss its depth. Someone came to him, troubled by a mistake they'd made. They'd spoken harshly to someone they loved, and the guilt was consuming them. They couldn't stop thinking about it, replaying it, wishing they could take it back. The Buddha asked them to imagine two scenarios. In the first, you take a small crystal of salt and drop it into a cup of water. The water becomes undrinkable, bitter, and harsh. In the second, you take that same crystal of salt and drop it into the Ganges River. The river flows on, pure and clear, the salt completely dissolved and diluted by its vastness. Same salt crystal, same wrongdoing, same mistake, same regret, but completely different effects depending on the container holding it. The problem isn't the salt, the thing that happened, the mistake you made, the hurt you experienced. The problem is the size of the container you're holding it in. When our minds are small, contracted, tight with judgment and fear, when we're identified with our mistakes or our hurts as the whole of who we are, even a tiny grain of difficulty makes everything bitter. The mistake becomes our identity. The hurt becomes our whole story. We can't see anything else because the container is too small to hold both the difficulty and any perspective on it. But when our minds are vast, spacious, able to hold both pain and peace, both failure and fundamental okayness, the same difficulty dissolves into something manageable. It's still there. We're not pretending it doesn't exist, but it's held within something larger, within understanding, within compassion, within the recognition that one mistake or one hurt doesn't define the totality of existence. The teaching is radical in its simplicity. You don't need to eliminate the salt. You need to expand the container. How do we do that? How do we expand from cup to river? This is where contemplating impermanence becomes not just philosophy, but medicine. Real medicine for real suffering. Most people hear contemplate death or remember impermanence and think it sounds morbid, depressing, life denying. But it's actually the opposite. It's one of the most liberating practices possible. Everything changes. This isn't Buddhist belief or religious doctrine. It's observable fact. Your body is changing right now. Cells dying and being born, organs aging, hair growing or falling out. Your relationships are changing, even the most stable ones shifting in small ways every day. Your circumstances, your health, your beliefs, your feelings, all changing, always, whether you notice or not. And at some point, this body will stop functioning. We know this intellectually, but emotionally we live as if we have infinite time, as if the people we love will always be here, as if we can address what really matters someday when things settle down. The contemplation of death isn't about becoming fearful or obsessed with mortality. It's about clarity, about seeing what actually deserves your life energy and what you've been wasting it on. Try this right now, if you're willing. Imagine yourself at the very end of your life. However you picture that, in bed, peacefully, surrounded by loved ones, or alone, suddenly or gradually, doesn't matter. Just imagine that moment when you know this is it. These are your last hours or minutes. From that perspective, looking back at your whole life, what matters? The argument you had last week, does it matter? The promotion you didn't get 3 years ago, does it matter? The time your friend forgot your birthday, does it matter? That thing someone said about you that hurt your feelings, does it matter? Or does what matters look completely different from that vantage point? Maybe what matters is whether you loved well, whether you were kind when it was difficult, whether you stayed present for the small, beautiful moments, instead of always rushing toward the next thing, whether you forgave, whether you tried, whether you let yourself be fully alive instead of constantly defending against life. There's a Tibetan yogi named Milarepa who expressed this perfectly. When asked about his religion, his spiritual practice, his beliefs, he gave the simplest answer: "My religion is dying without regrets." Not dying without mistakes. We'll all have those. Not dying having achieved everything we wanted. Life's too unpredictable for that. But dying without regrets. Without the ache of, I should have, I could have, why didn't I? Dying without regret means living in alignment with what actually matters to you. Not what you think should matter, not what others say matters, but what you know in your deepest self is real and true and worth giving your life to. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Most of us aren't living that way. We're giving our days to things we don't actually care about, to conflicts that won't matter next month, to worries that are ultimately irrelevant to what makes a life meaningful. We spend hours angry about politics we can't control. We sacrifice our health for careers that won't remember us. We avoid difficult conversations that could bring real connection. We waste years proving we're right about things that don't matter. We postpone joy, postpone love, postpone living fully because we're waiting for everything to be perfect first. The death contemplation cuts through all of that. It's not about being morbid. It's about clarity. What deserves your life energy? Because you're spending it right now, today, this hour. Life energy isn't infinite. You have a certain amount, and then it's gone. Are you spending it on what matters? This contemplation expands the container in a way nothing else quite can. When you hold your current problems against the backdrop of your whole life, of your mortality, of what will matter when it's over, suddenly, the container is much bigger. The difficulties don't disappear, but they're held within a vaster perspective. That argument with your partner yesterday, still real, still needs addressing perhaps, but is it worth the hours of resentment you've been carrying? The disappointment about the path your career took, still real, but is it worth sacrificing your present peace to regret the past. The uncertainty about the future, still real, but is worry actually helping, or just stealing the only time you definitely have, which is now? The third type of patience emerges from this understanding. It's accepting that life is fundamentally uncertain, impermanent, beyond our complete control, and finding peace anyway. Not peace because everything's going according to plan, but peace because we've stopped demanding that it should. This doesn't mean becoming passive or defeated. You still address what's addressable, still work toward what matters, still protect what needs protecting, but you're not at war with the fundamental nature of existence. You're not exhausting yourself fighting with the fact that things change, that control is limited, that life is uncertain. You accept these as the conditions within which you're living, not as problems to be solved, but as the context of being human. Notice, right now, are you holding your current worries in a cup or an ocean? Is your mind tight and small, contracted around whatever's bothering you, unable to see anything except the problem? Or is there some spaciousness, some ability to hold both the difficulty and an awareness that this too is impermanent, that you've survived every hard thing before this, that something in you is larger than any circumstance? This isn't about pretending problems aren't real. It's about not letting them colonize your entire consciousness, about maintaining some perspective, some space, some recognition that this moment, as difficult as it is just one moment in a whole life. The practice of impermanence contemplation isn't something you do once and check off the list. It's an ongoing remembering, a repeatedly returning to what's true. Everything changes. Everyone dies. Nothing stays. That sounds depressing until you really sit with it and discover it's actually freeing. If everything changes, then this difficult situation will change too. If nothing stays, then you don't have to carry yesterday's pain into today. If everyone dies, then maybe the petty conflicts aren't worth the energy you're giving them. The Buddhist teachers recommend making this contemplation practical, not abstract. Don't just think, oh yes, everything's impermanent. Actually imagine specific scenarios. Imagine the people you love most aren't here anymore. Not to torture yourself, but to recognize, while they are here, am I present with them? Am I giving them my actual attention or just my distracted leftover awareness? Am I taking them for granted because I assume they'll always be available? Imagine your current circumstances, your home, your job, your health, whatever stability you have, gone. Because it will be, eventually, in one form or another. Does that make you panicky and grasping? Or does it help you appreciate what's here now? Imagine yourself old, near the end, looking back. What will you wish you had done differently? What will you wish you'd spent less time on? What will you wish you'd said experienced, risked, forgiven. And then here's the beautiful part. You can start living that way now. You don't have to wait until you're dying to live without regrets. You can make choices today based on what will matter when you look back. You can forgive today the person you'll definitely forgive eventually, because holding grudges is exhausting and life is short. You can be present today with the people who won't always be here. You can do today what you'll wish you had done when it's too late. This is what the third type of patience ultimately teaches. Stop fighting with time, with change, with mortality, with the fundamental uncertainty of existence. These aren't problems to solve. They're the conditions of being alive. And when you stop fighting them, when you accept them, really accept them, not just intellectually agree, but let them sink into your bones, something relaxes. Not because life becomes predictable or safe or fair, but because you're no longer demanding that it should be something it isn't and never will be. You're free to respond to what's actually here, instead of being paralyzed by how you think things should have been. Free to appreciate what's present, instead of being consumed by anxiety about what might be lost. Free to live fully in the only moment you ever actually have, which is this one, right now. The container has expanded from cup to river, not because the difficulties got smaller, but because your capacity to hold them got bigger. Because you've stopped identifying so completely with the changing contents of your life and started recognizing something in you that's vaster than any circumstance. This is patience with reality itself, with the way things actually are, rather than the way we wish they were. And paradoxically, this acceptance, this clear-eyed recognition of how things really work, is what finally allows us to engage with life skillfully. We stop wasting energy on impossible battles with the past or the nature of existence. That energy becomes available for what can actually be addressed, what can actually be changed, what actually matters. And we discover something the teachings have been pointing to all along. Peace isn't found by controlling circumstances. It's found by making peace with the fundamental uncertainty and impermanence of all circumstances. That's the third type of patience. The hardest one, perhaps, because it asks us to accept what we most want to resist, but also the most liberating, because it's where we finally stop fighting and start living. We've explored the three types of patience, with difficult people, with the challenges of practice, and with reality itself. But understanding patience isn't enough. We need to know how to actually become less reactive, less easily disturbed, less at the mercy of circumstances and other people's behavior. The Buddhist teachings offer two paths that work together. They seem different on the surface, even opposite in some ways, but they complement each other perfectly. Like two wings of a bird, you need both to fly. The first path is about loosening your grip. The second is about opening your heart. Together, they reduce reactivity more effectively than either could alone. Let's start with the first path, loosening attachment. There's a paradox at the heart of our suffering. We care deeply about things that, in the larger scheme of our lives, don't ultimately matter very much. And that caring, that desperate investment, makes us vulnerable, reactive, easily disturbed. Think about the last time someone's casual comment ruined your whole day, or when not getting invited to something consumed your thoughts for hours, or when a small setback at work made you question your entire career. The intensity of your reaction wasn't really about what happened. It was about what you'd invested in the situation, your sense of worth, your identity, your hope for how things should be. The teachings identify 4 areas where we tend to make these investments, 4 worldly concerns that drive most of our reactivity. First, pleasure, wanting comfort, ease, good feelings, everything to go smoothly. When this is threatened, we become irritable, impatient, quick to anger. Someone interrupts our relaxation and we snap at them. Plans change and we can't let it go. The coffee isn't quite right, and it colors our whole morning. Second, possessions and gain, wanting security, money, things, status markers that prove we're doing okay. When this is threatened, anxiety and defensiveness arise. Someone gets promoted instead of us, and we spend weeks bitter. We lose something and feel violated, as if part of our identity was stolen. Third, praise and approval, wanting recognition, validation, to be told we matter and we're good. When this is threatened, we become needy, defensive, desperate for reassurance. Someone doesn't acknowledge our effort, and we feel invisible. A friend forgets to respond to our message, and we spiral into wondering what we did wrong. Fourth, reputation, wanting to be important, respected, someone people admire or at least don't dismiss. When this is threatened, pride and shame take over. Someone criticizes us publicly and we can't sleep for days. We're excluded from something and feel fundamentally diminished. These 4 concerns aren't wrong or bad. Of course we want comfort, security, recognition, respect. We're human. The problem is how tightly we grip them, how much of our peace we've wagered on getting them. The more our happiness depends on these external conditions, the more vulnerable we become. Every situation becomes high stakes. Every interaction carries the possibility of gaining or losing something crucial to our sense of okayness. We're living on an emotional razor's edge, always one comment or outcome away from being deeply disturbed. The path of loosening attachment isn't about becoming cold or indifferent. It's not about pretending we don't care about anything. It's about relocating the source of our peace from external conditions to something more stable within us. This happens primarily through contemplating impermanence as a daily practice. Not once when you first hear about it, but regularly, actually bringing your attention to how everything changes. Right now, in this moment, your body is different than it was 5 minutes ago. Cells have died, been replaced, shifted. Your mood is different than it was this morning. The people you know are aging, changing, maybe even changing how they feel about you, without you knowing. Everything you're gripping so tightly, your job, your relationships, your possessions, your reputation, all of it is in flux right now. Nothing is as solid as it seems. Nothing stays the same. This isn't meant to make you anxious. It's meant to help you see clearly, so you stop investing your entire sense of well-being in things that are fundamentally unreliable. When you deeply understand that everything changes, you start to hold things more lightly. Not because you love them less, but because you understand that grasping tighter doesn't actually keep them. The tighter you grip, the more it hurts when things inevitably shift. A person who's made peace with impermanence has a different relationship with the 4 worldly concerns. They still enjoy pleasure when it comes, but they're not devastated when it goes. They appreciate recognition when it's offered, but they don't need it to feel valuable. They work toward goals, but aren't destroyed when outcomes differ from plans. This is freedom, not coldness. The difference is crucial. A cold person has shut down, defended against feeling, built walls to avoid pain. They're not free. They're imprisoned in their own armor, unable to connect deeply with anything. A free person feels everything: joy, disappointment, loss, love, but isn't controlled by those feelings. They can be fully present with pleasure, without grasping at it, fully present with pain, without being destroyed by it. They're responsive rather than reactive. The practical gift of this path is simple but profound. You stop needing every situation to validate you. Someone doesn't return your call. Disappointing maybe, but not a referendum on your worth. You don't get the recognition you hoped for? That's about circumstances, not about whether you're valuable. Plans fall through. Inconvenient, but not catastrophic to your sense of self. When your peace isn't constantly at stake in every interaction and outcome, you become so much harder to disturb. Not because nothing affects you, but because you're not interpreting everything as proof of whether you're okay or not. This brings us to the second path: expanding love and compassion. If the first path is about loosening your grip on external conditions, the second is about loosening your grip on self-obsession. And these work together beautifully. Here's what the teachings observe. The more genuinely we care about others' well-being, the less obsessed we become with protecting our own narrow interests. And the less self-obsessed we are, the less reactive we become. Think about a time when you were completely absorbed in helping someone. Maybe caring for a sick child, or supporting a friend through a crisis, or focused on a project that would benefit many people. In those moments, weren't you less sensitive to slights? Less concerned with whether you were getting proper credit? Less reactive to small frustrations? When your attention is genuinely oriented toward others' welfare, there's less mental space for the constant surveillance of, how am I doing? Am I being treated fairly? Did they notice me? Are they thinking well of me? This isn't about becoming a doormat or ignoring your own needs. It's about having enough genuine concern for others that your ego isn't constantly at the center of every situation, interpreting everything as either supporting or threatening your sense of self. The practice is learning to see difficult people as suffering rather than as threats. That person who criticized you harshly, they're probably struggling with their own insecurity. The colleague who took credit for your work, they're likely desperate to prove their worth in ways they don't even understand. The family member who always finds fault, they're usually drowning in their own disappointment and projecting it outward. This doesn't excuse their behavior, but it reframes your relationship to it. Instead of, they're attacking me and I must defend, it becomes, they're suffering and inadvertently splashing their pain onto others. When you see someone as suffering, something natural happens. Compassion arises more easily than defensiveness. Not because you're forcing yourself to be nice, but because you're seeing more clearly what's actually happening. There's a therapeutic truth here that changes everything when you really understand it. A loving person doesn't feel as threatened by what others think or do. Not because they don't care about anything, but because their sense of okayness isn't completely dependent on external validation. Their heart is large enough to hold both their own experience and others' struggles without collapsing into reactivity. Think of someone you know who has this quality, maybe a grandparent, a teacher, a friend. Someone who seems genuinely kind, but also somehow unshakable. They're not cold or distant, but they also don't get pulled into drama easily. They can be criticized without becoming defensive, can witness suffering without being overwhelmed, can be present with difficulty without making it all about them. That's what this path cultivates. Not by forcing yourself to care about others when you don't, but by gradually shifting your perspective from, how does this affect me, to, what's actually happening here for everyone involved. The practice is simple but requires genuine intention. When someone does something that typically triggers you, pause before reacting. Take one breath and ask yourself, what might be driving their behavior? Not to excuse it, not to make yourself accept mistreatment, but to see more clearly what's actually happening. Are they in pain? Are they afraid? Are they trying to meet some need in the only way they know how, however clumsily? Are they simply exhausted, overwhelmed, doing their confused best in a difficult situation? When you can hold this larger view, your own reactivity naturally diminishes. Not because you've forced yourself to be patient, but because you're seeing a fuller picture than just, they did something I don't like. This path also has a beautiful side effect. As you practice seeing others with more compassion, you naturally begin extending that same compassion to yourself. You recognize that you too are sometimes clumsy, sometimes reactive, sometimes causing harm while trying to meet legitimate needs. And instead of harsh self-judgment, there's understanding. The two paths work together like two wings of a bird. Loosening attachment helps you stop being so vulnerable to external conditions. Expanding love helps you stop being so obsessed with protecting a fragile sense of self. Together, they create a kind of resilience that isn't about becoming hard, but about becoming spacious enough to hold whatever arises. When you're less attached to outcomes and less obsessed with self-protection, what's left? Presence, clarity, the ability to respond to what's actually needed, rather than just react from old patterns. The capacity to stay grounded when people around you are losing their ground. You can love fully without needing people to be different than they are. You can work toward goals without being destroyed when results differ from expectations. You can experience disappointment without interpreting it as proof that something's fundamentally wrong with you or your life. This is what reducing reactivity actually looks like. Not becoming numb or disconnected, but becoming free. Free from the exhausting work of trying to control everything. Free from taking everything personally. Free to be present with life as it actually is, rather than constantly at war with how it isn't what you expected. Both paths require practice. You won't transform overnight from someone who's easily disturbed to someone who's unshakable, but you can start today. Today, you can notice when you're gripping too tightly to some outcome and consciously relax your grip a little. You can remind yourself that whatever you're so worried about is impermanent anyway, including your worry about it. Today, you can practice seeing one difficult person with more compassion. Not excusing their behavior, but recognizing they're struggling just like you struggle, confused just like you're confused, trying to be okay in the only ways they know how. Small practices, done consistently, change the shape of your mind over time. Slowly, you notice you're less reactive than you used to be. Situations that would have consumed you for days now barely register. People who used to push all your buttons somehow have less power over your inner state. Not because you've become cold, but because you've become free. Free to choose your response, rather than being hijacked by reaction. Free to stay present with what is, rather than constantly fighting with what isn't. These two paths letting go, and opening up, they work together like two wings. And with both wings functioning, you begin to fly above the turbulence that used to ground you completely. Still present, still engaged, still caring about outcomes and people, but no longer trapped in reactivity, no longer at the mercy of circumstances, no longer needing everything to be different than it is just so you can feel okay. That's the freedom these two paths offer. And it's available, bit by bit, to anyone willing to practice. There's a problem at the root of so much of our reactivity, our defensiveness, our need for external validation. It's how we measure our worth. Most of us base our sense of value on where we stand relative to others. We're always comparing, always measuring ourselves against invisible standards, always trying to figure out if we're above or below some imagined line that separates the worthy from the unworthy. Think of it like a ladder. We imagine ourselves standing on a particular rung. Maybe we're higher than some people. We have more education, more money, more followers, more talent at something specific. Maybe we're lower than others. They're more attractive, more accomplished, more naturally gifted. And our entire sense of okayness depends on which rung we occupy. This creates constant anxiety, because if your worth is tied to your position on the ladder, you're always vulnerable. Someone could climb past you, you could slip down a rung, the ladder itself could shift, and suddenly, your rung doesn't mean what it used to mean. So we become defensive. We can't tolerate criticism because it threatens our position. We can't celebrate others' success because it feels like they're climbing past us. We can't admit mistakes because that would mean we belong on a lower rung. We're trapped in exhausting vigilance, constantly monitoring where we stand. The Buddhist teachings offer something radically different. They suggest that instead of identifying with your current position, your achievements, your status, your qualities compared to others, you identify with your capacity for change. This sounds abstract until you understand what it means practically. Every human being, regardless of where they currently are in life, has 3 innate capacities that can't be taken away. These aren't things you have to earn or prove. They're built into the nature of consciousness itself. The first capacity is the ability to purify, to let go of negative patterns. Everyone can reduce harmful habits. Everyone can weaken reactive tendencies. Everyone can release grudges, soften defensiveness, transform anger into understanding. It doesn't matter where you start. You have this capacity. The second capacity is the ability to cultivate virtue and wisdom. Everyone can become more generous, more patient, more kind. Everyone can develop deeper understanding of how things work. Everyone can strengthen the qualities that make life better for themselves and others. This capacity exists in you right now, regardless of how much you've developed it so far. The third capacity is the ability to benefit others. Everyone has something to offer. Everyone can make someone's day a little easier, a little brighter, a little less painful. It doesn't have to be grand or recognized. A kind word, honest attention, holding space for someone's struggle, these matter, and everyone can do them. Now here's what changes when you identify with these capacities instead of your current position. If your worth is tied to being successful, then failure threatens your entire sense of self. But if your worth is tied to your capacity to grow from both success and failure, then nothing threatens you fundamentally. You're not worried about defending what you've achieved because you're focused on continuing to develop. If your worth is tied to being smart, then looking foolish feels devastating. But if your worth is tied to your capacity to learn, then mistakes become valuable information rather than shameful failures. If your worth is tied to being admired, then criticism feels like an attack on your very existence. But if your worth is tied to your capacity to refine your character, then criticism becomes useful feedback rather than existential threat. The shift is from "I am successful" or "I am unsuccessful" to "I am growing." From "I am smart" or "I am stupid" to "I am learning." From "I am good" or "I am bad" to "I am developing." This isn't just playing with words. It's a fundamental reorientation of how you relate to yourself and your life. When you identify with a position, you're always looking backward, defending what you've already achieved, terrified of losing it. You're brittle, easily threatened, needing constant reassurance that you still occupy the rung you think you deserve. When you identify with capacity for change, you're looking forward. You're interested in where you're going, not just where you are. You're flexible rather than brittle, curious rather than defensive. You can acknowledge limitations without shame because limitations are just your current starting point, not your permanent identity. There's a therapeutic insight here that changes everything when you really feel it. When you identify with direction rather than position, time becomes your ally instead of your enemy. Think about that for a moment. If your worth depends on your current state, how you look right now, what you've achieved so far, where you stand compared to others today, then time is terrifying. You're getting older. Your looks will fade. Younger people will surpass you. What you've accomplished will become less impressive as standards change. Time is eating away at everything you're using to prove your worth. But if your worth is based on your capacity to grow, then time is your friend. Every day is an opportunity to develop further. Every challenge is a chance to strengthen your capacity. Every year adds depth and understanding that wasn't possible when you were younger. You'll know you've made this shift when you notice a feeling inside that's hard to describe but unmistakable. It's a sense that time is on your side, that whatever comes, success or failure, praise or criticism, gain or loss, you'll grow from it. Not in a naive, everything happens for a reason way, but in a grounded confidence that you have the capacity to work with whatever arises and become stronger, wiser, more capable through the engagement. This doesn't mean you stop caring about outcomes. You still work toward goals, still hope for good results, still feel disappointed when things don't go as planned. But your fundamental okayness doesn't depend on any particular outcome. You're okay because you're growing, regardless of whether this specific situation worked out the way you wanted. The practical difference this makes in daily life is enormous. Someone criticizes your work. Instead of defending or attacking back, you can actually listen. Is there something useful here? Even if the delivery was harsh, is there a kernel of truth that could help you develop? You don't get the promotion you wanted. Instead of spiraling into, I'm not good enough, you can ask, what can I learn from this? What capacity can I develop that will serve me regardless of which organization I'm in? A relationship ends. Instead of feeling like a failure, you can recognize, this is painful, and also I'm learning something about myself, about relationships, about what I need to work on for any future connection to thrive. None of this makes difficult things easy. It doesn't erase pain or disappointment, but it prevents you from adding an extra layer of suffering on top, the layer that says, this outcome means something terrible about my fundamental worth as a person. You're not defending a position anymore. You're cultivating capacity, and that subtle shift changes everything about how you move through the world. Understanding patience is valuable. Building genuine self-worth is crucial, but transformation requires actual practice, and practice needs to be balanced. Many people who begin spiritual practice make the same mistake. They find one thing that works for them, one technique, one approach, one aspect of practice, and they focus on that exclusively. It makes sense. We naturally gravitate toward what feels effective, what gives us results we can feel. But the teachers warn against this. Because development isn't one-dimensional. It's like trying to build a strong body by only training your legs. You'll have powerful legs, sure, but you'll still be unbalanced, vulnerable, incomplete. The Buddhist tradition describes 4 essential pillars that need to develop together. Think of them as 4 legs of a table. If one is much shorter than the others, the whole thing tips over. The first pillar is calm, what's called shamatha in the traditional language. This is cultivating the ability to settle your mind, to concentrate, to find peace, even when circumstances are chaotic. It's what most people think of when they hear meditation, learning to be present, to not be completely swept away by every thought and emotion. This pillar is crucial. Without some ability to calm the mind, you're constantly at the mercy of your own mental chaos. You can't think clearly, can't respond wisely, can't access the deeper understanding that's available when the surface waves settle. But calm alone isn't enough. You can be very peaceful, very concentrated, very skilled at quieting your mind, and still be cold, closed off, unable to connect with others. You can meditate for hours and still be selfish in how you live. That's why the second pillar is essential: love and compassion. Opening the heart, developing genuine care for others' well-being, softening the constant self-obsession that narrows our world down to just our own concerns. This pillar transforms how you relate to everyone and everything. It's what prevents spiritual practice from becoming just another form of self-improvement, another way to feel superior. When your heart opens, the whole project shifts from "how can I get what I want" to "how can I be of benefit?" But love without wisdom can be naive, even harmful. You can care deeply about others and still enable their destructive patterns. You can be compassionate, but lack the discernment to know what actually helps versus what just feels good to give. So the third pillar is wisdom, called vipassana or insight. This is seeing reality clearly, understanding how things actually work rather than how we wish they worked, recognizing impermanence, seeing through the illusions we create, understanding the patterns that create suffering and the patterns that create peace. Wisdom without calm is just intellectual understanding that doesn't penetrate deep enough to change you. Wisdom without compassion becomes cold analysis that doesn't care about the human beings caught in these patterns. But wisdom, combined with the other pillars, illuminates everything. And then there's the fourth pillar, which people often overlook because it's less obviously spiritual. It's virtue, ethics, how you actually live your daily life when no one's watching. This means cultivating integrity in your actions and words. Being generous, not just when it's easy, but when it costs you something. Being honest even when lying would be more convenient. Keeping commitments, not using people. Taking responsibility for harm you've caused. Virtue is the pillar that grounds everything else in reality. You can be calm, loving, and wise in meditation, but if your daily life is chaotic, selfish, and dishonest, the other three pillars are just performance. How you treat the cashier at the grocery store matters more than how peaceful you feel in meditation. When all four pillars develop together, something extraordinary happens. The calm you cultivate makes space for compassion to arise naturally. The compassion motivates you to develop wisdom so you can help more skillfully. The wisdom shows you why virtue matters and how to live it. The virtue strengthens your calm because you're not carrying guilt and secrets that disturb your peace. They support each other, amplify each other, create a kind of synergy where developing one helps the others grow. It's like a meal that has protein, vegetables, grains, and water. Each element is valuable on its own, but together they provide complete nourishment in a way that any single element alone cannot. Most people unconsciously gravitate toward one or two pillars and neglect the others. Some focus entirely on calm, spending hours in meditation, but remaining emotionally closed and unable to connect with others. Their practice becomes an escape rather than engagement. Some emphasize love and compassion, but avoid the difficult work of actually calming their minds or examining their beliefs. They care a lot, but stay reactive, still caught in old patterns. Some pursue wisdom, studying extensively, understanding teachings intellectually, but without the other pillars. It's just information that doesn't transform them. They can explain Buddhism perfectly while remaining impatient, selfish, and reactive. And some focus on virtue, being very good, very moral, very disciplined, but without developing inner peace or wisdom. It's rigid and joyless, driven by fear rather than genuine understanding. The balanced path requires honest assessment. Which pillar have you been emphasizing? Which have you been avoiding? Often, the one we avoid is the one we most need. The pillar that feels least natural, least comfortable, least interesting, that's usually where our greatest growth lies. This is where having a mentor or guide becomes invaluable. Someone who knows the path, can see your blind spots, can point out where you're avoiding difficulty, by staying with what's comfortable, can offer the specific guidance that would most benefit your particular situation. It doesn't have to be constant contact or intensive supervision. Even occasional check-ins, every few months, maybe, can provide the course corrections that keep your practice balanced and effective. A small adjustment early saves years of wandering in circles. The goal isn't perfection in all four pillars. It's ongoing development in all four directions. Always working on something in each area, even if progress is slower in the pillars that challenge you most. Because when all four develop together, transformation becomes possible in a way it simply isn't when we only focus on what comes naturally or what feels good. We become more complete human beings, calm and passionate, wise and caring, internally developed and externally responsible. That completeness is what patience ultimately looks like when it's fully embodied. Not just the ability to tolerate difficulty, but the capacity to remain grounded, clear-hearted, and responsive regardless of what arises. And that capacity emerges from balanced practice sustained over time. not from any single technique or insight, but from the patient cultivation of all four pillars, working together to transform who we are. We've explored 3 types of patience, 2 paths to reduce reactivity, the importance of genuine self-worth, and the 4 pillars of balanced practice. We've covered a lot of ground, but there's a danger in all this understanding. The danger is thinking that understanding is enough, that knowing about patience is the same as being patient, that agreeing with these teachings intellectually means they've actually changed how we live. There's always a gap between understanding and embodying, between knowing what we should do and actually doing it when it's difficult, between the wisdom we admire in teachings and the reactivity we display in daily life. So, let's talk about where this all actually becomes real. And it begins in a place most people overlook. It begins with yourself. Here's a truth that might be uncomfortable to hear. You cannot offer others what you haven't given yourself. If you're harsh with yourself, constantly criticizing, judging, finding yourself lacking, that harshness will leak out onto others, no matter how much you try to be kind. If you can't forgive yourself, you'll carry resentment toward others, even when you think you've let things go. If you have no patience with your own confusion and mistakes, you'll have little genuine patience with anyone else's. This isn't a moral judgment. It's just how it works. We relate to others through the lens of how we relate to ourselves. Think about someone you know who's constantly self-critical. Notice how they often end up being critical of others too, even when they're trying not to be. The internal harshness finds external targets. It has to go somewhere. Or, think about someone who's genuinely kind to themselves, not in a narcissistic way, but with real self-compassion. Notice how that kindness extends naturally to others. They don't have to force it or fake it. It flows from the inside out. So patience with yourself isn't self-indulgence. It's not making excuses or avoiding responsibility. It's the foundation for being able to extend genuine patience to anyone else. Self-forgiveness is particularly crucial. Most of us carry a backpack full of things we haven't forgiven ourselves for. Things we said in anger years ago. Opportunities we wasted. People we hurt. Sometimes accidentally. Sometimes when we knew better, but did it anyway. Times we were weak, when we wanted to be strong, or selfish, when we wanted to be generous. And we replay these moments, judging ourselves, convinced that if we just feel bad enough about it, somehow that makes it right. But it doesn't. The past doesn't change no matter how much guilt we carry. All that happens is we become people who are simultaneously trying to grow while dragging the weight of unforgiving self-judgment. Here's what happens when you truly forgive yourself. First, you have to face what you did, honestly. Not minimize it, not make excuses, but see it clearly. Yes, I did that. It caused harm. It wasn't my finest moment. This is harder than it sounds because we're usually either defending ourselves or drowning in shame, rarely just seeing clearly. Then you have to understand the conditions that led to it. You were confused, or scared, or overwhelmed, or simply less developed than you are now. This isn't excusing it. The harm still happened, but it's recognizing that you weren't a villain. You were a confused person, making choices from limited understanding. Finally, you have to make the decision to release it. Not forget it. The memory can inform how you choose differently going forward. But release the constant self-punishment, the belief that you should suffer forever for past mistakes. When you can do this with yourself, forgiving others becomes possible. Not automatic or easy, but possible in a way it simply isn't when you're still carrying unforgiving judgment toward yourself. Because here's what you discover through deep honesty with yourself. You see how easily your own emotions hijack you, how you can be calm one moment and completely reactive the next, how good intentions don't always translate into skillful actions, how you hurt people sometimes not from malice but from your own pain, your own confusion, your own clumsy attempts to protect yourself or get what you need. And when you truly see this in yourself, not as something to be ashamed of, but as simple truth about being human, you start seeing others with the same compassion. That person who snapped at you? They're probably in the middle of their own emotional storm, just like you've been countless times. That friend who let you down? They're probably overwhelmed and confused about their own priorities, just like you've been. That colleague who took credit for your work? They're probably desperate to prove their worth in ways they don't fully understand, just like you've been desperate in your own ways. This doesn't make their behavior acceptable. It doesn't mean you don't set boundaries or address harm, but it means you stop taking it quite so personally. Stop interpreting it as evidence of their essential badness or your essential unworthiness. They're clumsy, just like you're clumsy. They're confused, just like you're confused. They're trying to be okay in a world that's often overwhelming, just like you are. The practice of patience with yourself is simple, but requires honest attention. Notice when you're being harsh with yourself. That voice in your head that says you're stupid, or a failure, or you should have known better, or you're not as good as other people. Just notice it. Don't fight with it or judge yourself for judging yourself, which just creates another layer. Just notice. Then, consciously soften. Not by lying to yourself about what happened, but by speaking to yourself the way you'd speak to someone you love who made a mistake. Yes, that was difficult. And also, you're learning. And also, you don't have to be perfect to be valuable. And also, tomorrow, you can try again. This softening isn't weakness. It's actually what allows you to see your mistakes clearly enough to learn from them. When you're drowning in harsh self-judgment, you can't think clearly. You're just defending or collapsing, neither of which leads to growth. But when you can hold your mistakes with some kindness, some understanding, you can actually examine them without being destroyed by them. You can ask, what was I trying to do? What got in the way? What might work better next time? Questions like these only become accessible when you've stopped beating yourself up long enough to think clearly. This is where patience really begins. Not with grand gestures toward others, but with small moments of self-compassion when you've fallen short of who you want to be. Now, understanding all of this intellectually is valuable. But intellectual understanding alone doesn't change anything. The real work is in the gap between knowing and doing. We've all had this experience. You hear a teaching that moves you, that makes perfect sense, that feels like exactly what you need. You're inspired. You understand clearly. You're certain this will change how you live. And then 2 days later, you're right back in your old patterns, reacting the same way you always have, as if you'd never heard the teaching at all. This is normal. This is how transformation actually works. It's not dramatic and instant, despite what we might hope. Real change comes from small, consistent practice over time. Not from understanding everything perfectly, not from dramatic one-time breakthroughs, but from choosing slightly differently today than you chose yesterday, and choosing slightly differently again tomorrow. Think of it like this. If you want to get physically stronger, you don't do one massive workout and expect to be transformed. You do consistent, moderate workouts over months. Each one makes a tiny difference you can't really see. But over time, those tiny differences compound into real strength. Spiritual practice works the same way. Each time you pause before reacting when you'd normally snap, that's a tiny increment of change. Each time you notice you're being harsh with yourself and consciously soften, that's a tiny increment. Each time you see someone's behavior as suffering rather than as attack, that's a tiny increment. None of these moments feels particularly significant, but they accumulate, and 6 months from now, you'll look back and realize you're responding to life differently than you used to, without quite knowing when the shift happened. Here's something else that's important to understand. Spiritual growth isn't linear. You're going to have good weeks where everything clicks, where you're patient and clear and responding wisely. And then you're going to have terrible days where you completely lose it, where every bit of practice seems to evaporate, where you're as reactive as you ever were. This doesn't mean you've failed. It doesn't mean the practice isn't working. It means you're human, and human development involves setbacks, regressions, difficult periods where old patterns resurface. The practice isn't about perfection. It's about direction. Are you generally moving toward more patience, even if there are days of impatience? Are you generally developing more compassion, even if there are moments of harshness? Are you generally becoming freer, even if you sometimes feel stuck? That's all that matters, the overall direction, not whether every single day is perfect. So here's a practical invitation. Not something you have to do, just something to consider if you want this teaching to move from your head into your life. For the next week, choose one practice. Just one, not 10 things to remember, not a complete transformation of your life, just one small thing to work with. Maybe it's noticing when you're resisting reality, catching yourself in that "this shouldn't be happening" thought, and pausing to recognize, but it is happening, so what now? Or maybe it's pausing before reacting when someone tests you. Just one conscious breath between trigger and response, one moment where you remember you have a choice about how to engage. Maybe it's practicing impermanence contemplation once daily, taking 5 minutes to simply notice everything is changing right now, including this situation I'm so worried about, including these feelings I'm having, including this very breath. Or maybe it's cultivating compassion for one difficult person, not trying to like them or excuse their behavior, just practicing, seeing them as confused and suffering rather than as your enemy. Pick one, whichever one calls to you, or whichever one feels most needed in your life right now. And for 7 days, just work with that one thing. Not perfectly, you'll forget, you'll mess up, you'll have days where you don't do it at all. That's fine. Just keep coming back to it when you remember. That's the practice. Not doing it perfectly, but returning to it. Because here's what happens with consistent small practice. It stops being something you do and starts being how you are. It integrates. It becomes natural rather than forced. At first, pausing before you react requires enormous conscious effort. You have to catch yourself, remind yourself, deliberately choose differently. It's exhausting. But after doing it 100 times, it starts happening automatically. You find yourself pausing without having to force it. Your nervous system has learned a new pattern. The teaching has moved from concept into embodied reality. That's the goal here. Not to know about patience, but to be patient. Not to understand these teachings intellectually, but to have them living in your body, your responses, your automatic reactions. And that only happens through practice. Small, consistent, imperfect practice over time. One more thing worth saying as we close this exploration. Every moment is a fresh start. You don't have to carry everything you did yesterday into today. You don't have to let this morning's reactivity define this afternoon. You don't have to wait for some perfect moment when conditions are ideal before you start practicing. Right now, this moment is available for a different choice. You can pause before reacting right now. You can soften your harshness with yourself right now. You can see someone with compassion right now. Not tomorrow when you're feeling more together. Not next week when you have more time. Not someday when you've read more or meditated more or become a better person. Right now, exactly as you are, with all your confusion and imperfection. That's actually liberating when you let it sink in. You don't have to wait. You don't have to be different than you are before you can start practicing. You can start from exactly where you are, which is the only place you ever actually start from anyway. So the teaching becomes real, not through understanding everything, not through having profound insights, not through becoming perfect. It becomes real through small moments of choosing differently, through pausing when you'd normally react, through softening when you'd normally harden, through staying present when you'd normally escape. These small moments are how patience moves from concept into reality, from something you know about into something you are. And that transformation, quiet, gradual, built from countless small choices, is what actually changes your life. We've traveled far together through these teachings on patience. And what have we discovered? That patience isn't passive acceptance of harm or defeat. It's wise recognition of what actually is, clear-eyed and grounded, able to respond skillfully rather than react blindly. That the people who test you most are offering something rare, a chance to develop patience that can't be cultivated any other way. They're not obstacles to your peace, but invitations to discover a peace that doesn't depend on everyone behaving perfectly. That the boring phases of spiritual practice, the desert stretches, where nothing seems to happen, these hide the deepest transformations. Most people quit right before the breakthrough because they can't tolerate the stillness before the shift. That your worth isn't in your current position on any ladder, but in your innate capacity to grow, to purify what needs releasing, to cultivate what needs strengthening. When you identify with this capacity rather than your circumstances, time becomes your ally. And that everything changes, always, including this very moment of struggle you might be carrying. Nothing stays fixed. Nothing is permanent. Nothing is quite as solid as it seems. Let's take 3 breaths together now. Just breathing, just here, just this. This teaching is here whenever you need it, as many times as you need to return. And wherever you are in the world right now, in whatever circumstances, may you find the peace you're seeking. Thank you for spending this time here. May you stay calm when life tests you.